personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy Podcast, where we discuss privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I am really giddy and excited to have a dear friend, a colleague, and collaborator with me on the show today, Arti Raman, who is the CEO of Titaniam. Hello, Arti.
Hey, Debbie, thank you for having me. So excited to be here. I've been watching your show for a while, and I'm thrilled to be able to have this dialogue with you here and share some of my thoughts.
Yeah.
Very cool.
This is exciting. So actually we met on LinkedIn. So you had contacted me on LinkedIn and you're like, oh, let's have a chat. And so, you really just stood out to me even then, just with your little short message. And I was like, yeah, let's get on the phone and talk and whatever. And we hit it off immediately. We liked each other a lot. We had a lot of similar thoughts about kind of data and privacy and what the challenges were. And I was really fascinated about your company and, just your tech journey in general. Everybody and everyone knows you, right? And then just the way that you built your product, I thought was really fascinating. And it doesn't hurt that you and I have a friend in common who's Chris Roberts, who raves about you like crazy. So I was happy to be able to meet you and be able to collaborate with you. So let's start with your, I think I'd be interested about your tech journey and then talk to me a little bit about Titaniam and why it was important to create that company.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for asking. And by the way, before I jump into that, likewise, Chris and everybody else I ran into continue to recommend that I reach out. And I thought, wow, Debbie must be so amazing. And you've turned out to be every bit as wonderful as they mentioned. So it's definitely a two-way feeling here. So yeah, a little bit about my background, which will create some context for this conversation. I have a mathematics background, so algorithms is something that I find fascinating, and I try to apply that type of thinking to important business problems. I think anywhere that you can bring some innovation and some true technology at the heart of solving difficult problems, I think you can create some value for businesses out there. And Titaniam is in that category. Specifically, the journey of the technology, it actually all started when, so I'm from India, if you can't tell. So 2019, middle of 2019, there was a large data breach in India where pretty much everybody in the country had their biometrics compromised from a large database, centrally controlled by the government. And I looked at that, and then right after that, there was a spate of them. I think Bulgaria, a number of other, super large visible breaches where people just lost a ton of sensitive data. And I looked at that and said, wow, there must be a better way for us to be able to utilize data that is so critical, people's identities, et cetera, while still keeping it safe. And so I started looking into encryption and how various encryption techniques are utilized and how they're able to facilitate data protection. And I also realized that it all comes to a grinding halt when the data needs to be used. So we have encryption at rest figured out for like the last 44 years or so with DES and then AES. And then for about 20, 25 years, we've had encryption in transit figured out where we're sending data from one place to another and using SSL, now TLS for that purpose. But every time the data actually needs to be used, we bring it back to clear text. And now we just have this data that we completely lose control over. And attackers are pretty smart, right? Ours is a domain where the adversary is extremely well-resourced, well-educated, highly motivated. And so, of course, they are coming in through the front door. They're coming in using legitimate credentials that causes all of the encryption and other protection to fall away. So I looked at all of that and I thought, there must be a way for us to implement and facilitate the usage of data without having it in clear text. And that's how Titanium was born. We looked to apply new algorithms and some, combination of new and old to be able to keep data protection on while data is used. And that, then started to speak obviously to the data breach scenario that I mentioned, but it also spoke to data privacy. Today it speaks to ransomware related extortion. So the applicability is pretty wide. But that was sort of like the heart of it, the genesis of the story.
Wow, that's really great. That's really great. Yeah, I love the way that you're thinking about this problem. That's one thing that I was really excited about when we started talking. I'm like, oh, that's totally brilliant, because I think also one other thing about, controls and people protecting data, if you make it hard for them to do their jobs, they're not going to do it, right? So if you're protecting the data while they can still work and it's not becoming like a barrier to them, I think that always helps. The parallel I give is like passwords. I think, a lot of companies, they create these really difficult passwords for people. And a lot of people, what they do is they post it on a post-it note on their computer, which is like the worst thing you could possibly do. So I think we need to find better ways to solve problems that make it easier for the person to comply and be able to, do their work, right?
No, absolutely. In fact, if you take a look at where we're having the most privacy issues or data compromises or leaks, breaches, whichever vector you want to look at, you'll find that it isn't in the individual user's access, right? It is actually in some sort of a bulk, like an administrative password. Like attackers will come and look for escalating privileges. They might come in from the individual, but they're trying to go over to a place where they can access just millions, tons of data at once. And so there isn't really a need to get in the way of the user doing their job. What we need to do is find a way for the mass access of data to not be possible. And one of the ways that, and there's several ways to do that, right? You can monitor data exfiltration, you can look for anomalous activity. But what my company does is it keeps that encryption on all the way until that end user needs to do their specific job, which is usually a tiny little sliver of the problem, right? Of the data access. So that's sort of how we look at it. But we also don't ever persist that data. We don't go back and save. So we're trying to block those sorts of paths while keeping their lives easy and transparent to the protection.
Yeah. I think one interesting thing that I see that happens in companies, and it's kind of a culture, the culture of the hierarchy of companies, right?
Yeah.
Where they, when they were talking about security or security training, they're really pushing it on kind of the lower level folks in the
Yeah.
company. And higher level people, they think is a perk that they don't want to follow those same rules of everybody else, but they're the ones with the access, right? So if a hacker gets to like a low level person's, or I can't say hacker because Chris is gonna be mad at me, a cyber criminal,
Hacker. Yes.
a cyber criminal
That's right.
gets access to a lower level person's credentials, that is very little they can do because that lower level person doesn't have a ton of access. So they're
Exactly.
looking for those executives that have more access than they should have. They're looking for those easy admin 1 2 3 passwords that they can get in, because that is where they can do the most damage, and that's kind of the high value stuff. So, again, I think that brings it back to what you're doing, where you're actually protecting the data and not just the perimeter of
Yeah.
the organization, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the theory for us is let's try to take the idea of zero trust and let's apply it to data itself, right? So true zero trust would mean that you don't give access to anybody as far as possible, right? Don't trust anybody. And when you do need to trust, make that as minimum privilege as possible, right? And so in that world, the high access individuals would be, those use cases would be taken as far as possible without disclosing the crown jewels, because they perhaps are not needed. I'll give you an interesting example. So usually in the world of security, we have a lot of analytics that happens, and analytics on security happens on pretty high value data, right? Like our security operations centers, other places are analyzing behaviors, looking at what people are doing in the organization. Lots of privacy red flags usually go up, but there's so much data that gets analyzed in these places that it isn't the humans sitting in front of their computers, looking through every bit. They are automating a lot of this work, and yet it has to happen without encryption or without any privacy controls, because that data needs to actually be utilized, sliced and diced and analyzed and figured out, who's doing what is anomalous behavior. It's a great example of where we can apply privacy controls, security controls, protection, because none of that, there isn't a person in front of a computer doing that, and yet that data is flowing through in a vulnerable way where it can be tapped in and exfiltrated. So many examples in an enterprise where you don't need to actually put that vulnerable data out where it can be lost. And those are the easy ones, right? The big buckets of data that we can just protect right away. Does that kind of resonate with what you were saying?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So let's talk about the elephant in the room here, right? Which
Yeah.
is kind of ransomware right now. So ransomware has been around for a while, right? It's not a new story. I think it's getting more traction in the press because now we see these really huge companies paying ransom and having these vulnerabilities that they're trying to deal with in their business. I guess the thing, I'm glad to see that more news is covering these things, and they kind of say, oh well, it's kind of out of hand, and maybe it is. In my opinion, I think we're hearing more about it because these are more larger companies that are being breached. So when smaller companies are being breached or gone out of business, it wasn't as big a story, but to see, having kind of you know, like gas pipelines stop
Yeah.
and people run out of gas, that gets attention. But in your view, where are we? Where are we going? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Like what's the state of play right now with like
Yeah.
ransomware?
Yeah. Yeah. See, I think what we've been missing is a good framework to understand what is happening. And I've been doing a number of talks recently to just lay it out the way we understand it. And I think that one of the biggest disconnects at this point, which I think is quickly getting bridged just by the experiences we're having in the market, the biggest disconnect is that ransomware has actually evolved from a two-stage attack to a three-stage attack. And many of us are still living in that two-stage world. And by that, I mean, it used to be that ransomware was about locking up resources and then extorting in order to unlock those resources back, right? So you would get infiltrated, your key systems would get locked up, you'd get a message that said, hey, you need to give us a key or you can't stand your systems back up. And companies would either pay or not pay, depending on how good they were at recovering their systems from backup. So in 2019, you had Garmin, a number of others pay, large sums of money just to get their systems back up because they weren't quite prepared or, to deal with that. Then, early 2020, late 2019, companies and more security people, right, were like, we're going to invest in resilience. You heard a lot in 2019 and early 2020 about cyber resilience. It was all over our news feeds as well. And that was all about how do you recover from an attack really fast. So that was in the two-stage world. And right, so through 2020, through late 2020, so many high-profile cases of companies that refused to pay ransom, I think Norsk Hydro was one of them. And there's like 22 counties in Texas that got together and did not pay. And so you had all this news about, hey, we don't have to pay because we've got our cyber resilience strategy. So that world is now changed because now the attacks are 3-stage. And the initial stage involves data exfiltration, right? So before your resources are locked up, your data is exfiltrated because that is the lever that is forcing companies, even when they have secure backup and recovery and the ability to get back on their feet, it is still forcing the ransom payout. So we need to sort of understand that the real threat, the real leverage that attackers have on companies now, and I don't mean to diminish the impact of not having critical systems stand up. So the 2-stage still holds, but in many cases, the real leverage they have now, especially companies like JBS was one of them, where it was about the data, right? Because in the data extortion stage, right, which is your 3rd stage, so first stage, exfiltrate, encrypt, second stage, extort to get your systems back up, third stage, extort for data. In that data extortion stage now, there's like 3 stages within that. So they'll ask the company, hey, if you don't pay up, we are going to post your data. If that works, or even if it doesn't work, they'll go to the customers directly. So we've now seen cases in the healthcare field where attackers are contacting customers one by one and threatening identity takeover, et cetera, if that ransom isn't paid directly by customers. So that's what we're now calling triple extortion. And finally, even when you do all of that, there's no guarantee that your data won't be leaked or sold. So this new 3-stage world, it's all about the data. And so I think that that shift requires us to invest not just in prevention and detection, right, which is definitely something that we have to invest, not just in backup and recovery, which is also a requirement, but also in data protection. And that's where I think like the zero trust for data idea, the always on data encryption, the data in use protection, making sure that we are moving that protection into the data becomes really important. Are you okay? Yep. So that was, that's sort of my take on it, that we need to move that and account for that 3rd stage. And when we do, we will hopefully find ourselves in a position that more often than not, the data that we're losing has been encrypted. And that definitely softens the blow tremendously. If you can say that, yes, we were breached, we lost our data, we stood our systems back up, but the valuable data was all encrypted, puts us in a much better place than having that data be sold or leaked or a customer is contacted directly. So that's why I've been harping on the data protection side for a while, saying, hey, this is something that we must do in place, identify your key assets and protect that data.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the way that you explain that. I know the thing that I have always been frustrated about is that I feel like a lot of people in the past have thought about kind of cybersecurity or security as being perimeter protection. Like, let's protect the outside so no one gets in. Where and then a lot of these breaches that have happened over the years, you see once they get in, they just have their run of the place. It's like, oh my God, like how many systems can they access? It's ridiculous. So for me, I always like to say, or I have a friend, David Kruger. He's amazing. He's going to be on my podcast too. He said, assume that the attacker's already inside.
Yeah.
Assume that they're in already. So now what are you going to do? So maybe that type of thinking will change the way people are thinking about how to protect the information that's inside. Because you want to limit the damage that can be done to the organization, correct?
That is so true. I've been using the word immunity a lot. I mean, we're in the pandemic, right? So maybe that concept is going to resonate. But I think moving from prevention to resilience to immunity is really important. And the whole idea of immunity is obviously, right, that you will get exposed, but you have to put something inside the organization that reduces or perhaps eliminates, if possible, the impact of that exposure. So I do feel that data protection if I may pitch data in use encryption, because I think that's the key part, right? Encryption at rest has been around, but if you keep that data protected as far as possible, then that makes your organization more immune than it would be otherwise.
Yeah. So one thing that comes up a lot, and I don't know, it bothers me quite a lot that to me, there's a overemphasis on the reactive side of this
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not enough on the proactive side. You know, it's hard. I work on the proactive side. So when I'm working with companies, I'm like, I'd rather be Smokey the Bear, right, than a firefighter at this point.
Yeah.
So I'm like, let's do things in a way that will reduce your risk of having an attack. And I think part of the psychology of this and why I feel like people aren't doing it on more of a proactive basis as they should be is like, that's something that happened to, that happened to someone else and that can't happen to me. You know what I mean? Or, I have cyber insurance. So if something happens, I don't need to be mature in my security or my privacy because if I get attacked, I have this cyber policy and they're going to pay me back or something like that. Or, those types of ideas. So I feel like I'm hoping that with the way things are happening now, companies are going to start to get more serious about proactive. What are your thoughts?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that, I'm having these conversations all the time now, and I have two types of people. I'll put them in two camps. There are the ones that aren't doing anything about it. I'll put them in two camps. The first ones are the ones that aren't able to prioritize this. And so that speaks to our general mindset of firefighting, right? Like it's the crisis of the day, and until it's a crisis, it isn't addressed. And so this type of proactive investment of time and even understanding and organizing yourself is just, there are just fires burning ahead of that. And I understand and respect it, but it's a bit of a shame, right, that you will only take care of it when it's a crisis. The other side of the house are folks that genuinely believe that it isn't possible to protect, and so they then rely on ways to mitigate risks, which is where the insurance comes in, or other things where they just feel like there's too much legacy. And I'm talking specifically, right, in terms of people that I've spoken to. There's just, organization is too old, there's too much legacy infrastructure, data is everywhere, I just don't know how to get my arms around this to even be proactive. And those folks, I think, genuinely can use some help with organizing or coming up with a framework or some way for them to prioritize their assets and their data and start to solve that problem. But both those sorts of people exist. And I think in both cases, you can kind of see why that might be the case. And yet it just creates all this exposure. And the thing you mentioned about insurance companies, it's really timely, right? Because we are reading that those models are failing, right? Those risk computations and the ability to offer, it's basically all going out the window. And that whole thing is being rethought. In fact, I'm in some conversations now where we're trying to come up with what else can be put in place as a certification, or certification is a big word, but some sort of assurance that we can say, hey, if companies have these measures in place, then that risk is actually significantly reduced, and that information can be given to an insurer to then be able to evaluate how they might write a policy, because that whole thing is a mess now.
Yeah, I just read an article last night in the Wall Street Journal about how insurance companies, and I knew this was going to happen. I thought actually it's happening much later than I thought it would. So, cyber
Okay.
insurance companies are really tightening up on those policies. So, they're tossing people are getting cancellations from policies. They're being asked a lot more detail about their security programs.
Yeah.
Their premiums are going higher. The cyber insurance will pay out much less, and that's just a trend that I knew that was going to happen. Especially, as we saw some of these huge, really big breaches to happen with these really big companies,
Yeah.
I was surprised they got paid out at all
Yeah.
because the reason why they some of these cyber issues or breaches were based on things that are basic hygiene, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
patching of servers, not sharing passwords, the basic things that no one wants to really hear about, but
Yeah.
organizational measures, not having post-it notes of passwords, on people's computers. So I feel like, if companies can get serious about doing those basic things and building on it, I think they could be in a better place. But then also, I don't know, this, I'm gonna dip into psychology again. I think there's a narcissism, right? In a way with companies where they think only of themselves. So let's say you have a block and there are like
Uh-huh.
5 companies on the block and one person gets breached. They're probably not going to share their experience with the other 4
Yeah.
companies because, whether they're embarrassed or they're whatever, they're
Mm.
not going to do anything to really help to say, hey, this happened to me. Here are things that, that we did to try to, protect ourselves, do this before this happens to you. And so I think cyber criminals have an advantage where it's a divide and conquer thing where everyone's thinking about themselves, so they can go from business to business and these tricks work every single time almost, right? From business to business. And I feel like if we're not trying to find a way to bridge those gaps and have that communication happen, like we're not going to be in a better place. What are your thoughts?
No, I completely agree with you. There's multiple factors at play here. There's, believe it or not, the compliance element right there as well, right? The more you come out and expose um, the mistakes, for lack of a better word, the mistakes that were made, they just feel like that puts them in a worse position to defend their stand or the measures that were in place. The other thing I'm hearing is that security leaders don't want to stand out. So nobody wants to get on, with a megaphone and say anything about the topic because they're afraid they'll stand out and become a target. And so becoming the voice of the defense seems to carry some risks in their mind. So there's that. And then finally, right, there's it can't happen to me. Like you said, it happened to them over there. It's likely not going to happen to me. And so not getting beyond their circle of trusted advisors to collaborate with somebody else, I think is a huge issue. But I've also seen recently some calls for collaboration, Debbie. So I'm thinking that this is going to change because I think people are realizing that there has to be government and industry collaboration. There has to be, business to business collaboration, and even just practitioner to practitioner with people sharing the tools and technology. So I'm thinking this is going to change. At some point, people realize, right, they're sort of all in it together. Well, that's my hope. I'm starting to see some signs of that.
I hope so. I want to see more public private collaboration on that. Even if it is, maybe in forums where people don't have to identify themselves. Like there has to be more information sharing and it needs to filter down to any type of business, I think. So not just the big boys, the small and medium sized businesses have been like obliterated by cyber attacks and ransomware. So a lot of those companies gone out of business, right? So,
Yeah.
they can't even tell their story because they don't have a story to tell right now.
Right.
So let's talk about privacy. So
Mhm.
privacy, I think, is a unique challenge. So in one hand, when you're handling data of individuals, you want to protect their rights. And part of their rights is to transparency, right? But then
Mhm.
you also have to protect the data. So I think in the past, data protection has been about not being transparent. Like let's lock something in a box and not look at it. We're saying, you know, this is data that you need. This is data that you asked for from a customer. You're a data steward. you have to be transparent with them, but you also have to protect it and be able to use it. Like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think this might be basically the most significant technology need in the coming decade, I think, because we have created ourselves a society that is so fundamentally dependent on data that our inability to properly handle it and process it and protect it is not going to end well, right? We're just creating all of these issues with that need for data. And so I think that it's so important, like you said, to be able to make that data, I'll say smarter, but to move some of those controls into the data itself so that we are able to let that data flow and be used while protecting it. And that speaks to, some techniques that have been around for a while, such as, data masking or anonymization, or, even synthetic data, ways to represent data, or data sets, and still make them available without compromising privacy. I think all of those things become really important because those are foundational. I don't believe that the constructs we have on top of that data are going away anytime soon. Like, we don't see AI disappearing. We just don't see any data-driven applications and functions going away. So I think our only choice is to come back and learn how to control and manage and protect that data and the individuals themselves. So at a high level, those are my thoughts. I think in terms of specific technologies, my company does play a role there as well. And, to the extent that we can instrument the data itself so that it can be forgotten, so that it can be retrieved, so that we can, we can collect and understand all of the data and control data that belongs to specific individuals and things like that. But I definitely think that's incredibly important. If we don't get that right, I think we're all in trouble.
Yeah. I also think that the nuance with privacy that I think companies struggle with a bit, which takes a lot more care and feeding and management, is that a lot of the data privacy regulations say that you should delete or dispose of data or return it to the person after its business use has ceased, right? So it's not as easy. It's not like a statutory requirement where you say, keep this data for 10 years where someone can automate that. So, okay, 10 years from now, delete, delete, delete. This is like, okay, you're done with this data set. And then, what I've seen over the past, because because companies didn't have any force behind them actually deleting the data, they just kept it forever.
Yeah.
And this is creating a lot of risk, cyber risk for companies, because if that data gets breached, now you have to go through and find out, who are the individuals that were impacted or how many people and stuff like that. So I've always been an advocate of people getting rid of things after it's
Yeah.
used, and I've been, very much so, because it's like, why keep it? Like, there's really no reason. A lot of times people didn't have a reason. So at least I think privacy regulation is creating a reason for companies to really look at their data and the data of individuals and how they're using it and why they're using it, so that they can actually do that. But then that creates, there has to be more granularity, right, in how they think about their data. So what is the end of a business process for you? And then what triggers that, and then what happens after you figure out, okay, we're done with this data, like how do you dispose of it and things like that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think that in many cases, the payment card people had stuff figured out before the rest of us. So if you remember, and I know it sounds like a non sequitur, but I'll join the dots here in a second. But if you remember how, we tokenized credit card numbers well before we learned and thought to tokenize other data. And so we've been transacting, making our transactions work with some sort of a stand-in instead of the actual credit card number. I think in a similar way, those guys have, sorry, I just lost my thought here. Remind me, Debbie, I just lost my thought here. Well, what specifically what was the focus of your question?
So I think I was talking about companies trying to figure out when data should be deleted at the end of
Yes,
a business process, as
thank you.
opposed to 10-year, delete this after 10 years or 5 years or something.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Sorry about that. So yeah, so where I was going with that was that in that side of the house, this idea of revoking permission has existed for a while, right? So companies, for example, have your credit card on file, right? And you can go in and you can change your settings and you can say, okay, delete this card. So I can do that at Amazon. I can do that anywhere. And I've been able to do it for a while where I can say, yes, you can keep my card. You can, I'll run my transactions on it, or no, now you can't keep my card. In the same way, I think the owners of the data should have this idea of controlling a key. And so businesses, enterprises are now doing this thing called BYOK, bring your own key. And when enterprises share data sets with third parties, they can enforce this BYOK mechanism where the enterprise controls the key and the third party that accesses the data set has access to that key, but that key can be revoked. So, in my opinion, a granular version of that and some sort of a way for the true, the owner of the data, the person that truly cares about it, that wants it revoked, can actually exercise some sort of control. So in our world, we are starting to see BYOK requests coming now at a granular level to be able to control those keys at a row level almost, record by record, so that the mechanism by which you delete that data actually is in the key itself. Because it's very difficult to chase that data around databases and all across the enterprise. If you had one control point, such as a key that you could delete, then that, in my opinion, that is sort of going to be the future. And you'll see many cases about data ownership, et cetera, where people are talking about a similar idea.
I hadn't not heard that BYOK. That's brilliant. I like that idea.
I
Because
didn't make it up, but I do like the term. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's going to be a lot going on with keys and who has it, who has the key to what data. And I talked to other guests about stuff like that. So I'm excited to see what happens in the future with technology. But that's one thing that really irritates me with companies. It's like get rid of, you can't. First of all, some data is so old that the knowledge has gone away in the organization.
Yeah.
So no one really knows, what's in that back room or what's in that cloud instance or whatever. And people are afraid to delete it because they don't know what's in it. And so that's a problem. That's one of those backdoor problems no one wants to really talk about. But it's something that I think should get more attention, especially because of, a lot of these data breaches. They look at
Right.
that stuff, the stuff that you don't want to look at. Someone will be very interested to look at it.
An interesting point there, and it's a little bit unrelated to privacy, but still relevant, which is storage cost. So you won't believe how many times I have in the recent 2 months run into this, because I've been digging and trying to understand, right? Like, what are your key assets? What is your data? And this issue of like skyrocketing storage costs from companies, hospitals, like, places that are just have all this data, where simply like deduplicating or deleting, it impacts you in significant ways. Like you can just justify that by simply saving on the storage cost, not to mention reducing your risk of being breached. And that data becomes a liability. I mean, I think you wrote a chapter in our book, right, about in the Back to Basics book, about your data being a liability and not an asset. But similar idea, and the justification can literally be savings in your storage. In fact, I was having a conversation yesterday with a company out of Germany that was sharing how in their area, the individual that I was talking to in their area, they're not able to go back and get their medical records past a year because the hospital doesn't have storage to store those things. There's just so much data. So that speaks to your point as well, that there's more than one reason we're seeing the impact of not deleting our data show up in many ways, breach and privacy. And, the side point here about how much we're spending.
Yeah. I love that. Also, just to bring up briefly, you know, and Chris Roberts made this point as well, and I agree with him. So I'm old enough to remember when people didn't connect everything to the internet, right?
Yeah.
So not everything needs to be connected to the internet, especially some of that older data. So I think people, I think now because people are so in that mindset that, oh, let's turn on web services for this or that. um, I remember when people used to have that discussion, like, should we put it on the web or not? Should we enable it for the web or not? And now it seems like it's almost automatic. So I think companies need to rethink that as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I've been in quite a few conversations where companies are asking us, making sure that we're offering our technology on-prem. Before it used to be, hey, are you cloud? Are you multi-cloud? Are you hybrid cloud? And are you SaaS? And those were the fashionable things to be. And now, the question, we're getting those questions as well, but we're also getting the question that, hey, we also want to make sure that you can offer this on-prem, because some of our critical items or systems and data, we are now thinking better have it offline or in our own control or on our own premises. So definitely, I see that. I also have a side thought that it's a little bit of a ship that has sailed, right? So there's no getting away from protecting our fully connected infrastructure as well.
Right, I think so. So, if it was the world according to Artie and we listened to everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy, whether it be technology or law, anywhere in the world?
In my opinion, we need to move from a state where we are figuring out who to show data to, um, who to not show data to, I mean, right? Managing that where data is available and then we figure out, who shouldn't see it, and flip it to a state where the default is private. Like that, I think, is like a fundamental shift in how you think, right? So you manage by exception instead of writing the rules on who should you turn it off for. And today, pretty much every system I've seen is wired the other way, where data is clear text and we'll mask it. We'll be like, hey, this person shouldn't see this bit, this person shouldn't see this other bit, but there is a super user somewhere, there is a manager, owner, somebody that gets to see everything. And I think that change will change the game, where that default is private. It is encrypted, it is tokenized, it's just not there, it's not available. And then you manage by exception who gets to see what. And I think that solves so many problems, and it forces us to think about who really needs the data. Because today we think about, who's it that we want to block? Hey, this is our enterprise, we have everything, but oh, that person over there is a third party, so we kind of want to make sure they don't get our data, but everybody in this perimeter gets to see it. Sort of needs to be the other way, where nobody gets to see it. And even internally you say, hey, do you really need it, and do you really need it? And of course the third party doesn't need it either. So my
Yeah,
opinion, having that default is super important.
that's brilliant. I love that. Right. Well, because you think the internet was built for sharing, so it wasn't built for security, right? And then
Yeah.
a lot of apps that have data, they were built to store data forever, like not to let it go. So some of them have I've seen products that have features that wouldn't let you get the data out of it once you put it in there. So I think we just have to, we need to think the opposite way now. So I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of change, right? Because some of these instrumentations are baked into our lives. So I heard somebody say the other day, we got into this mess one system at a time. We're going to get out of it one system at a time. I kind of resonated with that, although I, wish there was some large scale way of solving the problem. But I think step by step.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great session. I'm sure the audience will really enjoy it. It's always a thrill to collaborate.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for having me. It was great to share my thoughts. And as always, you have such a loud voice in the industry. So I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to have this chat with you.
Aw, that's so sweet. So we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.